Uh, Good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for coming to today's talk research session on the women of January 6th. Again, my name is Michael Gizzi. I'm a professor at Illinois State. I put the names of my co-authors who participated in this project, Haley Munir, Ethan Bolt, and Jason Byers, and we're from three different universities. Um, and we've been working on this project for over a year and probably have another year or two to go. On January 6, 2021, former U.S. President Donald Trump sparked a riot and insurrection in an effort to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, which he lost decisively. Um, Between 2,000 and 2,500 people marched across Washington, D.C., broke through police barricades, illegally entered the Capitol, committing numerous acts of violence and physical damage. The January 6th insurrection was one of the most significant attacks on American democracy since the Civil War in the 1860s. More than 1,300 individuals have been arrested for their crimes. Over 870 have been convicted in the 3 years since January 6th, including 131 women and 737 men. My colleagues and I have been doing a comprehensive qualitative and mixed methods study of the January 6th defendants, focusing on four distinct research questions. Who are the January 6th defendants? Can we identify profiles of different types of defendants? What's their connection to extremist groups or to extremist ideology? What did they do preparing for January 6th? How they behaved after it? A second research question is, how do the January 6th defendants use what we call neutralization techniques to justify their behavior? What have they tried to do to mitigate their actions and justify what they did on January 6th? And this is in their mitigation, their justifications to the judge at the time of sentencing. How were the January 6th defendants identified? Can we identify common patterns in the ways in which these defendants were found and arrested? So we're looking at investigative tactics. And finally, in a very quantitative part of the project, how have these defendants been sentenced? Do the sentencing decisions differ based on the president the judge was appointed by? So are Trump judges more lenient than other judges? What other differences are there? We're not talking about all that today, but this is the broader project. We conduct our study using publicly available documents from the American court system. Three types of documents that I'm going to describe in just a second, but the data came to us in PDF format. We used Adobe Creative Cloud to merge the three files into one document. I wanted one document per defendant. That was very important. So our unit of analysis was the individual defendant. We optimized the files to reduce overall file size under 5 megabytes. In Team Cloud, we knew all the files were going to be uploaded to the cloud and they were going to be all external files, but it was critical to us that we kept these small, because with potentially more than 1,000 files, we needed to be able to maximize the efficiency of MAXQDA in dealing with large pieces of information. These PDFs could be 80 or 90 or 100 pages long at times. So there's a lot of information. And the project file already is over a gigabyte, so it's big. Three different types of information we collected. The complaint and statement of facts. And this is a document that describes the process by which defendants were identified, the role of witnesses, tips, video surveillance, social media posts, geolocation data. So how they found the person, what the person did, and statements they made, videos they made. There's all sorts of information in the statement of facts. The second document was at the time of sentencing, after a plea bargain or after a trial. The government writes what's called a sentencing memorandum. The United States attorney, that's the prosecutor, writes a detailed document to the court explaining the actions of the defendant, the initial and convicted criminal charges, their criminal history, their co-defendants, their ties to extremist groups, and their recommended sentence. So this provided us with a lot of the information we were looking for. And then finally, After the government writes a sentencing memo, the defendant gets to respond with their own memo. Excuse me. And this is where they make the case to the judge about the sentence. This is where this document often includes detailed information about the defendant's background, their family history, any personal trauma they had experienced, while explaining their behavior, and often make arguments that fit under the guise of what we'll call neutralization theory, neutralization techniques. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So 3 pieces of data. Some of these documents we did have to pay for, so they're publicly accessible, but they're not all free. Some of these are on the internet already. Our research is a collaborative one. I have a team of 4 faculty members, and we had 1 graduate student. She's recently graduated. And we are using Team Cloud to conduct the qualitative content analysis. The project was done starting a year ago, and it was done in Team Cloud in MAXQDA 2022. The analysis of this project that I'm presenting today has been actually moved over to MAXQDA 24. So we initially did a pilot project of 5 cases where each researcher did initial coding after being trained by me. This served to help us, and we spent time talking about what codes we initially thought we wanted to capture, how we wanted to do it. One thing that we do is make sure when we code a segment, we include a code comment that sort of spells out what was going on and why this particular segment was coded. And it also enables us to do some preliminary types of intercoder reliability. It's a little challenging with this type of data because these documents are so long. But we then began coding documents. Each researcher would have a batch of 5 at a time. As the team lead, I organized the project file, and I reviewed the coding done by each researcher after they uploaded their data in between coding cycles. And so it was providing a second set of eyes on each case. And in the time since the coding's been done, almost every file's gone through even a third time, refining codes. Again, as the project grew bigger, the Team Cloud project file over 1 gigabyte, we made the decision in March this year to separate the data into different pieces, different projects for misdemeanor or minor cases versus the felony prison cases, and for what we're presenting today, and a separate project which we pulled out all of the women defendants. I talked a little bit about the coding system, but I'll give you some examples of how much coding there is here. We used a mixture of deductive and inductive coding to develop our coding system focused on 5 different areas: the defendant's actions on January 6th, the investigative arrest process, a defendant profile and background, a lot of information about them, the defendant's use of neutralization techniques to explain their actions, and the government and defendant's sentencing recommendations. That was just collecting information that we then turned into a variable later. The initial coding system was refined with numerous subcodes in later cycles using the smart coding tool. So here you're seeing the neutralization techniques, and you can see they're broken down into 6 different areas. And then here are many of the other codes. So there are a lot of codes. Okay, there's a lot of codes. Many of these, like the defendant actions, most of that was done by the researcher in the initial coding. Things like marital status, that was all refined later. We just coded for marital status. We coded for education. And then I went through using smart coding tool to refine and create the subcategories of it. We don't have information on everything. There are some documents where there just simply is, like, for example, no information about the defendant's educational background. It's just not included in the information we have. When I would see something like that, I would usually try to do Google searches to see if I could find additional information, but it was hit or miss. We do have age for every defendant, and and race for every defendant. But to be perfectly honest, as you'll see, it's out of 130 cases that we're looking at today, there are only 4 that are not Caucasian. In the analysis stage, we've been using AI Assist as a research assistant, using a full range of analysis features to explore the data, including the new chat with coded segments. It's been a really valuable, helpful way to identify key examples in such a large and robust data set. So the current study, Women of January 6th, to date, we've coded about 450 of the 868 defendants who've been sentenced, including all of the 131 women defendants. And we decided that it would be an interesting study to just focus on the women of January 6th. George Washington University issued a brief report on the women of January 6th in 2022, and it included about half of them and did not include a detailed content analysis the way we have done. We wanted to be able to understand who the women of January 6th were, what characteristics they have, were they actively engaged in extremist groups, what role did they play in those groups, what role did they play in the insurrection, how did they use neutralization techniques to explain their behavior, did they use a gendered lens in their neutralization techniques, for example, focusing on motherhood as one of the arguments that they would make. Women represent 15% of all of the January 6th defendants. There are 131 of them who have been sentenced. We can only study these cases after they've been sentenced. There are probably a handful more women who've been arrested but not charged, not convicted as of yet. But this is pretty much the population of women at this point in time. Next stage of our research will contrast these findings. Like we know that only 15 women received long-term prison sentences of more than a year, which was 11% of the women, but 30% of the men received similar sentences. So we know there are differences there. We know there are many more men who are more violent than these women. But we want to understand who the women of January 6th are. So how do we organize the data into MAXQDA? Initially, we had document groups that had the names of the researchers. So it would just say, the group would just say, Haley, Ethan, Jason, Mike. And their files were stored in there. That made a lot of sense. But once we completed the coding stage and we entered this process of analysis, it made more sense to reorganize the project so that we could use document groups and document sets as meaningful and analytical tools. And so I decided that we would sort the data by the sentence the defendant received. Jail only. Did they only receive a short sentence of incarceration in jail? This ended up being while it's under 12 months, the reality was it was under 3 months, 90 days or less. Did they receive jail and times on supervised release or probation? And so the defendant received both a jail sentence and a term of probation or supervised release. Did they receive just probation but no incarceration? And did they receive a felony prison sentence, a sentence of more than a year in prison? All of those also had supervised release afterwards, but we just called it felony prison. And so we coded information about the types of sentences, and then we used code patterns to initially sort the jail and probation only documents, and then reorganized, activated those documents, and then moved them into the new groups. Took a while, but it worked out pretty well. In addition, we used document sets to sort the defendants by age groups After recoding the age variable into a new variable, a grouping, a categorical variable in stats. So we used MAXQDA's stats module to say, were they in their teens or 20s? There were only two teenagers, so we just I did 18 to 29. Were they in their 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s? And so we could distinguish the data in multiple ways. And we can have other research sets as well if we want. So what do we know about the women of January 6th? Well, they range in age from 18 to 69 years old. Two of the women are transgender. One of whom was widely known because she was a leader in an extremist group known as the Oath Keepers. And although it never was mentioned in the documents, we know that she had served actually as a man in the United States Army before before her transition. And then a second one I found recently in going through the data. They range from 18 to 69. The median age of the women was 44 years old. They were almost exclusively Caucasian. We had two women who identified clearly as Latina, Hispanic, Latina. We had two women who were Asian. You'll notice there were no Black or African American women in the data set. There are only a handful of Black men in January 6th as well. Showing you a table created based on the breakdown there. So you sort of see. This is more interesting in many ways. We pulled this out of the stats module. Box plots looking at the overall distribution of the women. They go from 18 to 69. And you see here that the felony prison sentenced women are older than the rest. The jail only ones are the youngest, and the probation and jail are pretty close. The women of January 6th were most likely to receive a jail or a probation sentence. Only 15 women, 11% of our data, were sentenced to prison for more than a year. And these defendants were older than the typical offender. There was one woman who did not go to prison, but she received a 60-month probation term, which is the longest possible probation term in federal court. And she was convicted of several felony charges. But looking at it, the case, she was in her late 60s, and her co-defendant, her husband, was in his early 70s and had physical health issues. And so our assumption is they didn't get prison sentences because of their age and infirmity, but they did get a home detention sentence of a year. So sometimes the numbers, you have to go into the data to make more sense of it. Only 11% of the women were sentenced to prison, a year or more. In comparison, 30.9%, 228 men received a prison sentence. And the prison sentences for the men were much longer. There were several that were much longer. Only one of the felony sentences was received by a woman under the age of 30. I think she was 29. 11 of our defendants received very short jail sentences. These were among the youngest in the data. They were in the Capitol for a few minutes. They engaged in no violent behavior. They basically just sort of were dragged in with the crowd and left. 29 of the defendants, in addition to jail, probation, or prison, jail or probation, received some form of home detention, ranging from 2 weeks to 1 year. But of those, 23 of those 29 only had home detention under 90 days. So I would argue the typical woman defendant received either a probation-only sentence or a combination of probation and jail. So when we look at this, our typical women are here. These two kind of are they're different groups. And in the actual paper, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at these breakdowns. We're able to see what they were charged, what they were convicted of. And so these are actually a listing of the minor or misdemeanor charges and the felony charges that they were convicted either at trial or by plea bargain. The vast majority pled out their cases. And you can see the difference here. There were a handful of probation in jail and probation defendants who did have some felony charges, but did not get prison sentence. Whereas the ones who went to prison, you can see it. It's all very clear here. The vast majority of the misdemeanor cases were of a handful of charges: parading, demonstrating, and picketing in a Capitol building, entering or remaining in a restricted building. There was, very little difference. And in each instance, they pled guilty. We can break it down. So this is by sentence, and this is by age. So that can be useful as we move on. So what's their marital status? Well, 50 of the women were married. 10 were remarried, meaning they had been divorced, but they're in at least a second marriage. Currently, at the time of January 6th, so 60 defendants were married, 45%. We have 17 we were not able to find information on. And in each of those instances, numerous Google searches were done trying to see if we could identify if the person was married or not. 5 were widows. There were 10 who claimed to be in relationships. Some claimed to be engaged. We had another 14 who were divorced, and 28 were identified as single women. 3 of the women were divorced as a result of their actions. Ms. Suarez and her husband divorced in November 2021 as a result of her husband having turned her into the FBI concerning the incident matter. So she got arrested because her husband, what we would say in the US, ratted her out. And so she got arrested. They found her because of her husband. They're no longer married. That was my favorite of the examples there. On the women's education, this is the least persuasive data we have, and it says marital status there. That's supposed to say education. My bad. Much missing data. We have 51 cases where we could not find anything. So 38.9%, we simply could not identify what they had. But what was interesting to me was that at least 29 had some college or some years in college or graduated from community college or a certificate program. There were lots of nursing assistants. And to be a certified nursing assistant in the US, you have to have some post-high school education. 26 had undergrad degrees, 6 had graduate degrees, 1 was a medical doctor. She was a conspiracy theorist who was often focused on anti-vaccination stuff and anti-vax. Dr. Simone Gold. We had 5 high school dropouts. 26 had either a high school diploma or a GED. It's likely that many of the unknown had at least a high school degree, but we couldn't prove it, so we just left it as unknown. Now here's a really interesting piece. How did they get to DC? Who did they come with? Well, I would argue that January 6th for these women was a family affair. And what you have here is a code co-occurrence map, which was created out of using the code patterns of a list of all the co-defendants. 60% of the women defendants had co-defendants. 45 were with family members or intimate partners. 25 were with their husbands. 8 were with their children. 2 were with their child and husband together. 7 were with their parents. 9 with siblings. And you can see the breakdown here. 34 co-defendants were not related. So there were 34 co-defendants who were not related, and sometimes they were also with family members. But we could argue that for over a majority of the defendants, this was a family affair. Okay. This is an example from one of the documents. This is just one, Brittany Robinson and her 4 additional co-defendants, all of whom was her family member, from her father, brothers, sister, daughter-in-law. Oh, it's a daughter-in-law. That's right. So just giving you a sense that this was oftentimes a family affair. What did these women experience? The web of personal trauma was kind of interesting. And again, another Max map. Almost half of the defendants, 65 of them, uh, reported some sort of personal trauma in their life. A history of drug or alcohol abuse and mental health issues were the most common, but we had a wide range of things of physical abuse, having been in abusive relationships, whether it's by a parent, domestic violence, sexually abusive relationships as an adult. Um, defendants who suffered sexual abuse as children or young adults by family members or acquaintances, and so on. So we have a lot of information of trauma. And all this information comes in the defendant's sentencing memo, where they're trying to rationalize and explain away their behavior. Their lawyers are. And so you can see the breakdown here. So there's a lot of things. So we had 10 who claimed to be domestic violence victims. We had 10 who claimed major health problems. But here's an example, an extreme history of sexual and physical abuse. One wonders, this woman, she probably developed her mental health issues partly from being sold for sex by her own mother when she was a mere child to support her mother's drug habits. She's further traumatized by her ex-husband. A violent encounter with him occurred after he came home smoking crack for a week. He tried to rape her and he beat her so badly she went to the hospital. Another time he beat and raped her on a child drop-off day. She was with him from the age of 15 to 25, quote, when he tried to kill me. So this was not necessarily the typical example of trauma, but it's stuff we would see. She receives treatment for PTSD and major depressive disorder. What did they do on January 6th? So here we're using the code matrix browser and we're looking at our codes. They committed a wide range of offenses. We collected info on them. We're able to sort the defendant's actions by their sentence, try to identify patterns among them. We use the segment matrix, which is missing here, but it would be right here in the code matrix browser, to explore the substantive actions of the defendants. And so you can see here we would have code comments, and we would see the text, and a whole range of things that they did. Were the women of January 6th tied to extremist groups? This was an interesting, important question. That is Jessica Watkins right there. Only a small number of the defendants, 21, expressly claimed membership or affiliation with known extremist group. Either that, or they showed they were either affiliated with an extremist group, or they found it appealing. And so you can see the lists of the groups. Of the women, the Oath Keepers, there were 7 women who were affiliated with the Oath Keepers and 4 with the Proud Boys. Some only claimed to have followed these organizations online. So Don Frankowski told the FBI she previously followed the Oath Keepers, but she wasn't anymore. Others were active members, like Jessica Watkins, a 38-year-old resident of Champaign County, Ohio. She recruited individuals to her Ohio-based militia and drove with those individuals to DC, bringing with them multiple firearms to be used as part of a quick reaction force. She had military experience, and she went to prison for several years. So what does a typical woman defendant look like? Well, I would argue a typical woman defendant, the women of January 6th, a typical woman is a 44-year-old white woman who's either married in her first or second marriage, has children. We did collect information on children, has a high school or maybe some college education, might work in healthcare as a nurse or a nursing assistant or in a service industry job. There were lots of people who work in restaurants. We had one woman who was a bartender in an exotic men's club. I did not see Matthew's question, were any of the women members of more than one extremist group? The only way I would answer that was yes, in the sense that they all seem to claim allegiance to MAGA, but that's not really an extremist group. It's just a presidential cult. But no, none of them of the smart coding tool that I literally did last week, there were none that were in both. The typical woman defendant entered the Capitol, riled up the crowd, posted videos, taunted the police, but did not commit overall overt acts of violence. And thus, they got misdemeanor sentences of probation, and jail for the most part. They traveled to DC with a family member or a friend. They were attracted to the MAGA movement. They believed the big lie, but they weren't necessarily tied to an extremist group. Some examples. Here's Lisa Homer, 49-year-old, sentenced to 3 years of probation. She was at a Proud Boys protest the previous November. She entered the Capitol for about an hour wearing camouflage patterned helmet, goggles, and a ballistic plate carrier vest. She's a grandmother of one and a mother of four with an undergraduate education. She was divorced after being subjected to domestic abuse. A political activist who sat on numerous community boards in the Washington state area. Rachel Myers, 31-year-old high school educated woman who's a bartender in an exotic gentleman's club. It's a prior DUI, never married, no children. Parents divorced when she was a baby, raised by her father. One of her quotes was, "I'm totally fine with the Civil War at this point. It's beyond time. I'll be marching with the Proud Boys," things she posted on Facebook. Completely fanatical about Trump, believed all of his election lies. Believed that it was January 6th was a setup. They let him in because it was a setup. I watched it all happen. It was an absolute inside job. Oh, I left it out, but another thing of the typical woman has no criminal history, no prior criminal history, maybe some traffic stuff. Myers, though, was a lot of talk and not a lot of action, but she still got 24 months of probation. Dawn Bancroft was one of the very first women I coded. 58-year-old woman, owner of a gym. FBI tip led investigators to a video that allegedly showed her entering the Capitol building through a broken window and recorded a video in which she said, "We were looking for Nancy to shoot her in the frickin' brain, but we didn't find her." She wanted to shoot the Speaker of the House in the frickin' brain. She claims she lost her gym's CrossFit affiliation because of her arrest and has suffered daily because of her association with the events of January 6th. So finally, neutralization techniques. How did the January 6th defendants justify or explain their behavior? In what ways have they tried to mitigate their roles and tie them to the broader study of what we call neutralization theory? Sykes and Matsas wrote this theory. It was in Juvenile Justice in the 1957, in which they argued that juvenile defendants would try to minimize their criminal behavior through one of five techniques. This theory has been used in hundreds of studies across numerous fields since the early 1960s. And so there were five different types of neutralization. Did they deny responsibility for their actions? Did they deny injury? Their behavior wasn't serious. It produced few or no harmful consequences for others. Did they deny the victim? There were no victims. The victims are responsible for what happens. Condemnation of the condemners. Did they condemn those who were condemning them because they were guilty of things themselves and that they were hypocrites, or appealing to higher loyalties? Well, we began our study of defendants' neutralization techniques by simply identifying the things that they did and then later putting them into these categories. And so we had a whole slew of neutralization techniques that we looked at. Do they deny responsibility, deflect blame, ignorance of wrongdoing, lack of intent, active political expression, following the president's request, for example, showing support. They almost all claim that they showed remorse, so I don't take this particular one very seriously. Because when you're writing a memo to a judge, trying to get the judge to show leniency, you're not going to generally say that you're, you have to admit that what you did was wrong if you're going to get the judge to help you. So the 5 main categories, lots of techniques used. And the 3 most common that we see here was they would try to minimize their behavior. They claimed a lack of intent. And they were showing support for President Trump by going. So denial of responsibility. It wasn't my fault. The Lincoln acts are due to forces outside of my control, such as unloving parents, bad companions, or living in a slum neighborhood. Well, we had codes for several things tied to this, including deflecting blame on others, claiming ignorance of wrongdoing. We had that several. I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. You entered the Capitol through a broken glass window after breaking through a wall of police, whatever. Mob mentality. I was caught up in the mob. I was young and impressionable and immature. 78 of the 131 women made claims that fit into those categories. 35% each claiming they had a lack of criminal intent, deflected blame on others, or were caught up in a mob mentality. So here's an example. Valerie Urke, 53-year-old single woman, a college graduate, owner of a small business. Here's her social media page. It's got a flaming Q on it. That's associated with QAnon. Total conspiracy theory. Pled guilty to 1 count, parading, demonstrating, and picketing, sentenced to 3 years of probation. At no time in the process of making plans to attend the rally or during my attendance at the rally did I ever think I was breaking the law. The situation really blindsided me because I'd never had intent to harm or obstruct what was happening inside the Capitol building. I wasn't aware of the madness that was happening in the Senate chambers. I don't condone that. Okay, whatever. Some ways defendants neutralize their actions, appeal to a higher loyalty. I was asked to do this. How could I say no? We used 2 codes for that, specifically following Trump's request to go to the Capitol and going to DC to show support for the president. We also had we placed political protest under denial of the victim and an active political expression. Because this was saying, I'm only here to protest. But appealing to a higher loyalty is not about political protest. It's about, I'm doing this for Trump. And I went to the Capitol because at the speech, he told us to march on the Capitol and he would join them. Ms. Belger, intent in going to DC for the Stop the Steal rally was really a send-off for President Trump. And not in her wildest imagination did she ever think anything like what occurred would occur. Significantly, she didn't participate in the rally because she intended to undermine the United States or democracy. Quite the opposite. Ms. St. Cyr deeply trusted and admired former President Donald Trump. She attended the rally to support him because she truly believed the election had been tampered with. His speech at the Stop the Steal rally immediately preceded the march on the Capitol. Woo! I went a little too long. I only have a few minutes, but I can take whatever questions you have. There's a lot more to this. I tried to give you as complete of a picture as I could. Did I look at social media or use of membership? I didn't have to, yes, but I didn't have to hunt for that because that was actually in the statement of fact and in the government's sentencing memo. All sorts of examples. And then even when they had deleted their social media, the government was able to get those. Other questions? Thank you, Matthew. Classification for MAGA as a presidential cult. One of the hurdle was we have to buy some of the documents. We spent about $1,000 so far on the documents. Two is there are some cases where there are missing documents. I have a few women where I don't have their own defendant's sentencing memo because it's been sealed. Beyond that, not a lot of hurdles, just a whole lot of work. This research will be published in journals. Whether they're open access or not will depend on a lot of things. I can't promise you that. Depends if our universities will provide the funds for it. It's sort of a racket. What prompted the research specifically looking at the women? I had a graduate assistant in the spring, and she was doing her culminating project on this. And I knew that to work with 400 documents was overwhelming for me by myself. And as a graduate student, I thought that that was a lot for a master's project. And all of a sudden, I realized they said we had at the time half of all the women coded. And we decided it wouldn't be hard to code the next 60. And so in April and May and early June, we only coded women defendants. And then I realized it was an interesting question. It was an interesting topic. Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting session, Michael. And me personally, I found it impressive to see for which research question you used which explicit MAXQDA function. So this got really clear in this presentation.
Yeah, it wasn't as much about Team Cloud as much it was about the analysis process. But
yeah, but anyways, it was really interesting to follow. And thank you for sharing these links and insights.
You're welcome.
I think we don't have any other question. And super interesting. Yeah, we can stay 1 minute more.
Sure.
Open for comments.
Yes, Matthew, in the next book. We're actually planning on several articles out of this study and then a book length monograph. We figure there'll be a book on the January 6th defendants. Assuming they don't all get pardoned in January, but I don't see that happening.